This presentation is on deconstructing visual culture art education. There are three factors which influence visual culture art education: advances in technology, text as social construction, social cultural and social political changes. Advances in technology. I don't think I need to go in depth about how much technology has changed our lives. Certainly, from our iPhones to our computers to the internet itself has revolutionized all of life. Even to the point that we construct all of our environments at the highest levels for fun or for necessity. Text as social construction. As part of postmodern thought, linguistics has moved to the place where it is subjective. Study of the nature, structure, and variation of language, developing out of the study of hermeneutics, the theory and methodology of interpreting text. So, structuralism and post-structuralism has had its impact, moving us to semiotics, the theory and study of signs and symbols, especially as elements of language or other systems of communication. So, for semiotics, we would not just study language, but we would study very visual symbols and how its subjectivity in its context. Postmodern thought. Steiner Weil says in postmodernism, the focus is on the linguistic and social construction of reality, on interpretation and negotiation of meaning in the lived world. So, for example, an image such as this, it is entirely constructed. All these symbols, you may understand the larger symbol in the back of the people being of a wedding, but the symbols over top of them, we can't help but create some kind of meaning because they're an association. Had those images of socks and umbrellas and pears and light bulb not be there, all those type of things, we'd probably have a majorly different interpretation. Some of these French authors, French philosophers like Michel Foucault and Jean-Francois Lyotard and Derrida and Barthes, all these were part of postmodern deconstructionist theory in their various different fields. And so Roland Barthes actually came up with the term death to the author. And so in language and in literature, the idea of the classic, somebody like, did really Shakespeare, is he the person who we should always say, what's the meaning? He meant it this way. That's for sure what the meaning is. A classic view of it would say, yes, that is what he's meaning. But from what Barthes and others are saying, the idea is contextual. The viewer, the person who's reading the book, has a larger part for interpretation now. And that goes the same way with art. And so this is a major part of postmodern theory. In modernism, there is the object speaks for itself. The artist is certainly the person who is authoring the work, and the interpretation is what they mean it to be. In postmodern art, it's not so much that way. It's constructed, and the viewer or the reader is having a major part of that responsibility for interpretation. So, part of text as social construction, Lyotard talked about this idea of incredulity toward meta-narratives. And a meta-narrative is a story of mythic proportions, a study of meaningful enough to pull together philosophy and research and politics and art and relate them to one another, and above all, give them a unifying sense of direction. He did not believe in meta-narratives, and he saw them as having smaller narratives. There's no larger truth in the way that he looked at things, which is again a postmodern concept. So these larger meta-narratives that Lyotard is saying doesn't exist would be such things as the Enlightenment, Marxism, Christianity, Manifest Destiny, just to name a few. So as we construct our own interpretations, as we watch 1,000 television channels, as our lives are eclectic and multifaceted. Um, we really take on these multiple identities as people. Social, cultural, and social political changes. Um, Anthropology led the way in researching cultural differences. Marxist theory led to critical theory in education, and the multicultural movement of the social political upheaval in the 1960s revolutionized our United States. So, anthropology. Wagner states, if any single occupational group deserves the credit or the blame for bringing us into the postmodern era, it is the anthropologists. They created a new profession out of the study of otherness, and their findings have made it impossible for any literate person to believe that there is only one way of seeing the world. So, what has anthropology has had an impact as they go off and look at the world in a certain way. They don't go and find these people in New Guinea or Siberia and say, okay, they do this, this, and this, and then judge them for it. No, they just document whatever it is. If they sacrifice their children, if they take and eat plants that make them, they're basically like drugs. They don't judge them for any behavior whatsoever. They're just documenting as flies on the wall. That is the scientific tradition of anthropologists. But that mindset has come into a broader stroke of cultural view and belief. And so, an idea of there's one truth, the anthropologist is certainly undermining that concept. Certainly, the multicultural movement, the civil rights movement in the '60s, as I show you a picture here of Rosa Parks, who decided not to, give up her seat on the bus to a white Caucasian person, um, revolutionized our society, and is what it is today. So the social cultural changes in academia, as you have the anthropologists moving in the sociological realm, it feeds into visual culture studies over in Europe. The Marxist political science feeds into critical pedagogy, and just on that's in academics. These things feed into visual culture studies, and then it merges into visual culture art education. So, influenced by cultural studies and came to America from Britain in the 1980s, it appeared as a discipline in the 1990s, visual culture studies. And visual culture studies draws on nearly 24 fields in the humanities and is based in the theoretical writings of Barthes, Benjamin, Foucault, Lacan. These are all French, for the most part, French philosophers, and what we would consider either deconstructionist or general postmodern views. But some of the major literatures, literary theory has had a major impact, cultural studies has had a major impact, and media studies has had a major impact of visual culture studies. So defining visual culture art education, as I show this advertisement for Miller Genuine Draft Beer, that we could go on and on about as its sexualized meaning as an advertisement. Defining visual culture art education. Malcolm Barnard's definition of visual culture art education: anything visually produced, interpreted, or created by humans which has or is given functional, communicative, or aesthetic intent. Well, that's about as broad as you can possibly make it. And Paul Duncombe, who is art educator, who is one of the three people I've been researching for this presentation, probably the lead person, adopts this definition in his writings of visual culture education. So he's broadening it to extreme extent. Visual culture art education includes all humanly made or arranged artifacts or environments that have visual characteristics. Themes of visual culture art education. So again, I've come up with these 6 themes that visual culture art education has adopted from visual culture studies literature. And Paul Duncombe, Kerry Friedman, and Kevin Tavin are were and still are the lead scholars in art education on visual culture art education. So I looked through and I read every one of their articles and processed them and ultimately found these themes. So there's critical theory pedagogy, popular culture curriculum, visual literacy, situated knowledge, image contextualization, and transdisciplinary. Critical theory pedagogy. Artist is viewed through cultural studies and analyzed with the intent of understanding social and political power dynamics. So we can look at an image just for like art history. They don't really look at it from a socio-political direction and say that there's power dynamics to it. There is, historically, yes, those situations are there. But do traditional art historians typically do that? And certainly, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but I would strongly suggest art educators do not do that for the most part. And this is probably the major argument. They're saying, why don't we're basically allowing a visual interpretation to go unchallenged. And they have a point. So Paul Duncombe says visual culture studies adopts a critical view of society, seeing society as structured in power relationships that are unequal and unfair. Kevin Tavin says by focusing on everyday experiences, students see how popular practices and beliefs wield power in ways that seem invisible, natural, or unproblematic. This process becomes a tool for social reconstruction by challenging and offering alternatives to traditional frameworks and processes. Again, they're looking at things from this power side. So it's really taking the critical theory educational model and looking at everything from a sense of power and who has it and who doesn't. Kerry Friedman says if we view art and art education as aids to making life meaningful, as reflections of liberty, and as means through which people might pursue constructive forms of happiness, art education is a socio-political act. That's interesting. Art education is a socio-political act. You can't get any more clear. This is critical theory that they're adopting. Popular culture curriculum. Contemporary popular culture images are taught as the focus of art education. Some view this as anti-aesthetic because it focuses on the norm rather than the rare. So we're looking at, popular culture commercials and advertising rather than analyzing Monet's paintings. That's very different from what we've been doing in history. Paul Duncombe says, we are saturated by visual images just as we are saturated by language, and for our education to engage seriously with students' own cultural preferences, a broad semiotic conception of visual images is necessary. So he's saying that we need to be looking at students' needs. Students are engulfed in advertisement and movies and multimedia, and we should be analyzing those things to help them. Kerry Friedman says students may also feel more comfortable interpreting meaning from popular culture images than fine art because they usually have greater experience with the content of the images. If this is the case, curriculum should include ways in which students can interpret fine art through association and build on their previous knowledge about popular culture. Tavin says by limiting their students analysis to museum art educators consciously and unconsciously ignore imagery powerful to their students' lives. So they're taking a progressive influence in saying student-centeredness teaching. We need to adopt that, and what students are looking at is popular culture and multimedia and movies, and we need to be looking at that, not just fine art in museums. Visual literacy. As images invade our spaces, a need to understand the effect of visual phenomena become more urgent. Giving students the tools necessary to analyze complex images is the educational objective. Paul Duncombe says, for a long time, many art educators have advocated an inclusive view of the visual arts, but usually the popular arts are simply added on and, moreover, viewed from a fine art perspective. Okay, in other words, he's saying there's a bias that we're not looking at popular culture, we're only looking at high art. Friedman says this culture is rapidly shifting from text-based communications to image saturation and the fragmentation and recycling of visual culture in new combinations. These images are highly seductive and widely distributed through technology capable of reproducing sophisticated aesthetics that are intricately tied to social political meaning. Same thing. Situated knowledge. What this means is knowledge is personally constructed within their cultural context. This is taking influence from postmodern constructivist theory. Paul Duncombe says meaning does not reside in images themselves, but in the way they are used by people in different situations. When he's saying that meaning does not reside in images, he's more influenced by semiotics, postmodern concepts, than he is from modernism, which says the object does speak for itself, and you should interpret that very easily as a viewer. But he does not believe that. He also says the view that meaning is a social construction created from discourse and neither intrinsic nor universal is foundational for a definition of visual culture. So he's definitely taking a postmodern constructivist view. Kevin Tabin. Art education informed by and through visual culture would require a shift toward self-reflective discourse and situated knowledge. In other words, the viewer, as well as the object or text, becomes the center of analysis, and in turn, questions and issues are determined by the cultural conditions and texture of everyday experience. So again, you have the object here, but then you have the viewer, and those two combine to create this interactive reflexivity. Image contextualization. Because of postmodern relativity, the image should be studied in cultural context for a more accurate interpretation. Carey Friedman. In a real sense, contexts make art worth studying as an academic subject. Sociologists have long understood that the context of cultural artifacts contribute to their symbolic attached meanings. To ignore the contextual basis of production and interpretation in curriculum presents art as less a part of human existence than it actually is. Tavin states, interpretations and meanings would be articulated in specific contexts, specific historical movements, and within multiple discourses. This sense, students' knowledge is always unfolding and responding to changing historical and political conditions. Transdisciplinary. Art education should pull in multiple fields of study in their teaching for the purpose of communicating the cultural relevance of art in our everyday lives. Paul Duncombe says the study of visual culture is indebted to cultural studies. Cultural studies is a complex interdisciplinary field. Carey Friedman says visual culture actually refers to visual cultures. It is multicultural, multimodal, intercultural, and interdisciplinary. In conclusion, visual culture art education is influenced by postmodern thought, analysis of social culture power dynamics, focuses curriculum on popular culture art, teaches visual literacy, and analysis art from the viewer and the artwork. It keeps art in its cultural context, and it requires understanding from multiple subjects to grasp it. And this is the deconstruction of visual culture art education.